April the 5th, 1923. A hotel room in Cairo, the air thick with heat and the low murmur of the Nile beyond the shutters. Lord Carnarvon lies in bed, his face flushed with fever, a mosquito bite on his cheek turned into something far worse. Outside, the city sleeps under a sky the locals will later swear went dark without explanation. At the exact moment his breathing stops, the lights of Cairo flicker and die. Across the ocean, in England, his loyal dog Susie lets out a single, mournful howl and collapses. 4 months earlier, this man had stood in a sealed chamber that no living person had entered in over 3,000 years and shattered a wall of plaster to gaze upon the golden face of a boy king. Now he was dead, and a legend was about to be born, one that would grip the imagination of the entire world, sell 1,000 newspapers, and refuse to die for a century. Was it coincidence, infection, or something older, something written in hieroglyphs no one had yet bothered to translate? Stay with us, because before this story ends, you'll hear about the strange inscription some claimed guarded the tomb, and whether it ever really existed at all. To understand what happened in that tomb, we have to go back, far back, more than 3,000 years before Carnarvon ever set foot in Egypt, to a boy who should never have been remembered at all. Tutankhamun ascended the throne of Egypt around 1332 BCE, during the final chaotic years of the 18th dynasty, a golden age of pharaohs that had already given the world Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and the revolutionary, religion-shattering reign of Akhenaten, a ruler many historians believe was the boy's father. Akhenaten had turned Egypt upside down, abandoning the old gods for a single solar deity, the Anhen, and abandoning the ancient capital of Thebes for a new city built from nothing in the desert. When he died, the empire he left behind was fractured, its priesthood furious, its treasury strained. Into this uncertainty stepped a child, perhaps 9 years old, perhaps younger, married to his own half-sister in the way of Egyptian royal custom, and placed upon a throne built for a man twice his age. He would reign for only about a decade. Skeletal analysis and CT scans conducted in the 21st century suggest he suffered from a clubfoot, walked with the aid of canes, more than 100 were found buried with him, and may have battled malaria alongside a degenerative bone condition. He died around the age of 18 or 19, the cause still debated by scholars. A chariot accident, a fracture that turned septic, or simply the accumulated fragility of a body weakened since birth. Because his reign was so brief and politically inconvenient, he had restored the old gods his father had banished, but was still tied to that heretical bloodline. Later pharaohs quietly erased him from official memory. His name was left off king lists. His monuments were reused by successors. In the long run, this deliberate act of forgetting became the very thing that saved him. Tomb robbers in antiquity targeted the graves of pharaohs they knew were rich and remembered. Tutankhamun, a footnote, a nobody, was left largely undisturbed. By the early 20th century, the Valley of the Kings, that arid, sun-blasted gorge on the west bank of the Nile near Luxor, was believed by most Egyptologists to be exhausted. Tomb after tomb had been opened, plundered centuries earlier by robbers, then cataloged and stripped further by 19th century archaeologists, working with more enthusiasm than method. Howard Carter did not believe the valley was finished. He was not born into privilege, the son of an English artist, largely self-taught, who had come to Egypt as a teenager to sketch tomb reliefs and had worked his way up through sheer persistence and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Carter had a theory, based on fragments of pottery and a faience cup bearing Tutankhamun's name, found decades earlier in the valley floor, that the boy king's tomb remained undiscovered, buried beneath debris that everyone else had walked past. He needed money to prove it. That is where George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, entered the story. A wealthy English aristocrat, an amateur Egyptologist, and a man whose health had been shattered years earlier in a car accident, leaving him with a weakened respiratory system and lungs vulnerable to infection, a detail that will matter later. Carnarvon began funding Carter's excavations in 1907, and for over a decade, the results were modest at best. By 1922, with the excavation having produced little of real significance and the costs mounting year after year, Carnarvon told Carter he had one final season of funding to offer. If nothing was found, the search would end. Picture the scene: the desert heat pressing down on a handful of Egyptian workers and one determined Englishman, digging trench after trench into ground already dug 100 times before, the sun bleaching the limestone chips white, the silence broken only by pickaxes and the occasional muttered frustration. Time was running out. If you're finding this story as gripping as the archaeologists once did, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because what Carter found beneath the ruins of a long-forgotten worker's hut is about to change everything you think you know about ancient Egypt, and the deaths that followed are stranger than most people realize. On November the 4th, 1922, a young water boy on Carter's team stumbled, quite literally, upon a step cut into the rock, hidden beneath ancient workmen's huts that no one had ever bothered to move. Carter had the area cleared overnight. By the following day, a full staircase had emerged, descending into the earth, and at its base, a sealed doorway stamped with symbols Carter immediately recognized: the necropolis seal, the mark of the royal burial ground, undisturbed. He sent an urgent telegram to Carnarvon in England. At last, he had made a wonderful discovery in the valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Carnarvon sailed for Egypt immediately, arriving with his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, on November the 23rd. 4 days later, on November the 26th, 1922, Carter made a small breach in the doorway, inserted a candle, and peered through the gap into darkness that had not been touched in over 3,000 years. Behind him stood Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, and Carter's colleague, Arthur Callender. Carnarvon, unable to bear the silence, finally asked the question that has echoed through history ever since: "Can you see anything?" Carter's reply, recorded later in his own writings, has become one of the most quoted lines in the history of archaeology. "Yes," he said, "wonderful things." Inside, by candlelight, gold seemed to shimmer from every surface: gilded animal figures, dismantled chariots, alabaster vases, statues layered in black resin and gold leaf, a jumble of unimaginable royal treasure crammed into a space far smaller than anyone expected. This was merely the antechamber. It would take Carter and his team nearly 3 months of careful, painstaking cataloging before they dared approach the sealed doorway, guarded by 2 life-sized statues of the king. The doorway, they suspected, led to the burial chamber itself. That moment came on February the 16th, 1923. In front of a small crowd of invited officials and journalists, Carter broke through the final wall. Beyond it stood an enormous gilded shrine, so large it nearly filled the entire chamber, one of 4 nested shrines that would eventually reveal, layer by layer over the following months, a stone sarcophagus, 3 coffins, the innermost crafted from solid gold, and finally, the mummified body of Tutankhamun himself, his face covered by the now iconic golden death mask inlaid with lapis lazuli and colored glass, weighing over 10 kilograms of solid gold. It remains to this day one of the most recognizable artifacts ever unearthed from the ancient world. News of the discovery detonated across the globe. This was not simply an archaeological find. It was the first major historical discovery of the mass media age, covered by newsreels, telegraphed across continents within hours, splashed across front pages in London, New York, Paris, and Cairo. The Times of London had secured exclusive rights to the story, a decision that infuriated rival newspapers and, some historians argue, contributed directly to what happened next. Locked out of exclusive access, competing journalists needed a story of their own, and they found one in the death of Lord Carnarvon. Because on April the 5th, 1923, less than 3 months after that golden mask was revealed to the world, George Herbert died in Cairo. The official cause was pneumonia, a fatal complication arising from an infected mosquito bite that he had aggravated while shaving, combined with blood poisoning and his already fragile lungs, damaged years earlier in that near-fatal car crash. Medically, there was nothing mysterious about it at all, but the timing was irresistible. Within days, sensational headlines were asking whether the Pharaoh's tomb carried a curse, and one man in particular helped ignite that idea into an inferno. The novelist Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes and a devoted believer in spiritualism, publicly suggested that Carnarvon's death may have been caused by supernatural forces unleashed from the tomb, possibly through some form of ancient elemental released to protect the pharaoh. His comments, given enormous weight by his fame, were reprinted across the world, and the curse story exploded from rumor into global sensation almost overnight. Newspapers began compiling lists of everyone even loosely connected to the discovery who later fell ill or died, regardless of the years or even decades that separated these events from the tomb's opening. Some accounts claimed an inscription had been found at the tomb's entrance, warning that death would come on swift wings to whoever disturbed the pharaoh's rest, a phrase that has been repeated in books, films, and documentaries ever since. There is, in fact, no verified archaeological evidence that any such curse inscription existed inside or near Tutankhamun's tomb. No photograph, no translation, no artifact bearing those words has ever been produced by Carter, his team, or any Egyptologist who examined the site. It appears to have originated entirely from newspaper invention and later folklore, though some scholars note that certain other Egyptian tombs did contain warning texts intended to deter robbers, a detail that likely made the fabricated curse feel plausible to a public eager to believe it. We're only about halfway through this story, and the most surprising part is still ahead. The actual death toll, the statistics that debunk the myth, and the strange twist involving the man who discovered the tomb and somehow avoided the very curse everyone assumed would claim him first. Stick around, and don't forget to drop a comment telling us whether you think there's more to this than coincidence. In the years following Carnarvon's death, the legend only grew. Reports circulated that Carter's pet canary had been swallowed by a cobra, the symbol of Egyptian royal protection, on the very day the tomb was opened, an anecdote widely repeated though difficult to verify with certainty and likely embellished with each retelling. Stories spread of Carnarvon's dog howling and dying back in England at the exact moment of his master's death, and of the lights of Cairo mysteriously going dark, a detail some attribute to a simple, unremarkable power outage of the kind not uncommon in the city at that time, rather than any supernatural event. Other deaths were folded into the growing mythology. George J. Gould, an American railroad magnate who visited the tomb and reportedly died shortly afterward from a fever. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, a radiologist who X-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy and died soon after. Arthur Mace, a member of Carter's own excavation team, who died in 1928 after suffering from declining health for years, possibly linked to arsenic exposure from museum specimens, rather than anything connected to the tomb itself. But the numbers tell a very different story than the headlines of 1923 suggested. In 2002, the British Medical Journal published a rigorous statistical study examining everyone present at the tomb's opening or exposed to the burial chamber in its early excavation. The research found no significant difference in life expectancy between those exposed to the supposed curse and those who were not. Howard Carter himself, the man who had broken the seal, who had stood closest to the boy king's remains for longer than anyone else on Earth, lived for a further 17 years after the discovery, dying in 1939 at the age of 64 from lymphoma, a mundane, well-documented illness with no connection whatsoever to ancient curses. Lady Evelyn Herbert, who had stood beside her father at the moment of the tomb's opening and had even been rumored to be the first to slip inside the burial chamber before Carter, lived until 1980, well into her 70s. Scientists have offered rational explanations for the illnesses that did occur among excavation members. Sealed tombs, closed for millennia, can harbor mold spores, bacteria, and toxic gases produced by the decomposition of organic material, offerings of food, plant matter, and human remains left to decay in darkness for thousands of years. Some researchers have pointed to Aspergillus niger and Aspergillus flavus, fungal spores capable of causing severe respiratory infections in individuals with weakened immune systems, as a plausible, though not definitively proven factor in some illnesses connected to tomb openings throughout history, not only Tutankhamun's. High ammonia levels, formaldehyde gas from decomposing bandages, and even radioactive contamination from certain minerals used in ancient burial preparations have all been proposed as partial, evidence-based explanations, though no single theory accounts for every reported case, and Carnarvon's own death is most plausibly explained simply by his already compromised health, combined with a severe infection, nothing more exotic required. What cannot be disputed, however it is ultimately explained, is the extraordinary hold this story took on the human imagination and continues to hold to this day. The phrase "curse of the pharaohs" entered the English language permanently. It shaped an entire genre of cinema, from the universal horror films of the 1930s to countless adventure stories that followed, embedding the image of the vengeful, resurrected mummy so deeply into popular culture that many people today assume it originated in ancient Egyptian religion itself, when in truth, it is almost entirely a product of 1920s sensationalism layered onto a genuine and extraordinary archaeological achievement. So where does that leave us, standing at the edge of this story, looking back across a century of golden treasures, sealed doorways, feverish headlines, and unanswered questions? The historical record is, in many ways, remarkably clear. Tutankhamun was a real boy, frail and largely powerless in life, who became, through the accident of being forgotten, the best preserved royal burial ever found from ancient Egypt. Howard Carter's discovery in 1922 remains one of the greatest archaeological achievements in human history, painstakingly documented, photographed, and preserved for scholarship. Lord Carnarvon's death, tragic as it was, is well explained by medical science without any need to invoke forces beyond nature, and the curse itself, in the form the public came to know it, the swift wings of death, the darkened lights of Cairo, the howling dog, exists far more convincingly in the pages of 1923 newspapers than in any hieroglyph carved by ancient hands. And yet, there is something in this story that statistics alone cannot fully dissolve. The timing of Carnarvon's death, the sheer theater of that candlelit moment when Carter first peered into darkness undisturbed for 3,000 years, the eerie sense that some places, some silences, are not meant to be broken. Perhaps it truly was nothing more than an extraordinary chain of coincidences, amplified by grief, fear, and a press hungry for a sensational story in the aftermath of a war-weary world. Or perhaps, as some still quietly wonder, standing at the edge of that valley today, watching the sun set blood-red behind the cliffs where kings were laid to rest, certain mysteries were never meant to be fully solved, only carried forward generation after generation in the stories we choose to believe. If this journey into the Golden Tomb and the shadow it cast across the 20th century left you with more questions than answers, that may be exactly the point. So tell us in the comments what you believe really happened. Subscribe for more true stories from history's most haunting mysteries. And until next time, we'll leave the rest of the silence to the sands of the Valley of the Kings.